You're tuned in to the audio commentary track for Destroy All Monsters, and we are your hosts. My name is Steve Ryfle.
And my name is Ed Godziszewski, and we're the co-authors of a forthcoming book about the life and work of Ishiro Honda, the director of this film, as well as the original Godzilla and many other science fiction films made at Toho Studios between the 1950s and 1970s. And appropriately enough, we're recording this track in the year 2011, the 100th anniversary of Ishiro Honda's birth.
Destroy All Monsters was released August 1st, 1968 in Japan on a double bill with Honda's 1964 sci-fi picture Atragon. It was the 9th Godzilla movie produced at Toho Studios, and it was a turning point, the last entry in the series made by the four original creators of Godzilla, producer Tomoyuki Tanaka, director Honda, composer Akira Ifukube, and special effects director Eiji Tsuburaya, who's credited as a supervisor on this film while his protege Sadamasa Arikawa actually directed.
The Japanese title for this movie is Kaiju Soshingeki, literally translated as March of the Monsters. It's not quite as exciting as Destroy All Monsters, the English language title that Toho created to sell this film outside Japan. When the film was in production, Toho's working title was Operation Monsterland. And as a side note, the very first version of the script was titled Kaiju Chushingura. Kaiju, of course, means monster, and Chushingura refers to a famous historical story in Japan about the rebellion of 47 samurai who took revenge after their master was unjustly forced to commit suicide.
And also the name of the female alien invaders, the Kiloks, or Kirak in Japanese, is a reference to Kira Yoshinaka, a villain in the Chushingura story. Destroy All Monsters has at least one other alternate title. Beginning in 1969, Toho released a series of yearly matinee programs, the Champion Festival, which featured a new children's feature film or cartoon paired up with a classic Toho monster movie. The movies were actually edited down to about 70 minutes to emphasize the action and minimize dialogue, the ultimate step in these movies' devolution into children's entertainment. When it played at the Champion Festival in 1972, this film was called Godzilla Electric Battle Masterpiece.
When the Toho films were released in the U.S. back in the 50s and 60s, American distributors would often retitle them. But Destroy All Monsters is such a great title that American International kept it and built an entire publicity campaign upon it. In fact, they liked it so much that later when AIP released Gamera vs. Viras to American television, they retitled it Destroy All Planets.
And this title has become part of the pop culture lexicon. Today you'll find books and websites called Destroy All, fill in the blanks. We're pleased to be able to discuss this title because to us it was iconic, an event, the mother of all monster movies, and of course it's the origin of the Monster Island cliche. I grew up in the 70s in LA, and KTLA Channel 5 used to show the same movie in primetime 5 nights a week, and then again on Sunday afternoon, which allowed me to memorize entire movies very quickly. And to see this Justice League of monsters teaming up to defend the Earth together, you can imagine how exciting that was for my 10-year-old self. I wanted to grow up and work on the Monsterland staff. And now that I'm grown, and I have to admit the film isn't as quote-unquote good as I remember it, it still has these money moments, such as right here, the introduction of all the monsters on Ogasawara, and later the reporter doing his Howard Cosell, his play-by-play. Which one will be first? Godzilla? Rodan? Those moments still resonate with me.
Well, I have to say, seeing Destroy All Monsters in a theater as a 15-year-old kid is one of the most memorable movie-going experiences I've ever had. Ever. I can still clearly recall everything about that hot Saturday afternoon in August of 1969. I had no idea the film even existed until the day it hit theaters. There was no advance hype, and there wasn't any building of anticipation. It was just suddenly there. And seeing all these monsters all put together in one film, destroying the cities around the world, it was absolutely amazing. The futuristic setting and the concept of Monsterland made it that much more exciting. I was so blown away that I immediately went out to the lobby before the second feature, which was the tedious Jerry Lewis comedy Don't Raise the Bridge, Lower the River, and called home to tell my mom that I'd be late since I wanted to stay and see the film a second time. That was the first time in my life I'd ever done anything like that. And I came back 3 or 4 more times that week. I just couldn't get enough.
The popularity of giant monster movies peaked in Japan in 1967, a year when all 5 of the country's major movie studios released at least one Godzilla-type movie. But the bubble had really already burst. The Japanese film business was on the decline, and there were a number of popular giant monster shows on television by this time, so the box office numbers were falling. Special effects director Sadamasa Arikawa remembered that Toho saw this film as something of a grand finale, a send-off for Godzilla.
and as a result, Toho budgeted 80 million yen more than what it usually spent on a monster film, pushing the total budget to around 200 million. The exchange rate was fixed at 360 yen to the dollar at that point, so that meant the film cost approximately $550,000. With 11 monsters and several large set pieces, that budget was actually pretty tight.
And the screenplay for this film was co-written by director Honda and Takeshi Kimura, who was working under the pseudonym Kaoru Mabuchi. Kimura really had two distinct phases to his writing career. From the early 50s to about 1965, he wrote a wide variety of movies, including one of Honda's early films, the excellent war drama Farewell Rabal in 1953. Kimura also wrote, among other films, Hiroshi Inagaki's classic Daredevil in the Castle in 1961. And as for science fiction, Rodan, The Mysterians, H-Man, The Human Vapor, films that are considered Toho classics, were all his handiwork. Kimura was said to have been a member of Japan's Communist Party, and he was a very political and serious person who didn't mix well with his Toho cohorts. His best stories were direct and serious and often based on at least a facade of science. Kimura did not consider himself a fantasy writer, whereas Shinichi Sekizawa, Toho's other main sci-fi writer at this time, was adept at writing lighthearted fantasy.
Kimura's masterpiece is undoubtedly Matango, a film that is quite pessimistic about human nature. In fact, many of his best films have a rather dark atmosphere. His scripts for Gorath and The Last War, a nuclear disaster movie, are also quite effective. After 1964, Kimura adopted the pen name Kaoru Mabuchi. It's reported that he took the pseudonym because he felt that he was just writing for money and he didn't believe in what he was doing any longer. Kaoru may be either a man's name or a woman's, and it's been speculated that Kimura took this name to further conceal his identity. The second phase of Kimura's career spanned from 1965 to 1973, when he wrote a lot of science fiction films, including this one, and some others considered classics, such as Frankenstein Conquers the World and War of the Gargantuas, and films like Godzilla vs. Gigan and Godzilla vs. Megalon, the low ebb of the Godzilla series. As always, director Honda approached the story, no matter how outlandish, in a straightforward and serious way. Being set 31 years in the future, this film gave Honda an opportunity to show his vision of a utopia on the eve of a new millennium. His concept of Monsterland wasn't just as a prison for the monsters, but it was also a scientific research facility. Here's director Honda in a 1992 interview commenting on the concept of Monsterland and his vision.
The original idea was to show all of the monsters. We then started thinking about undersea farming. Eventually, we came up with the idea of an island on which all of the monsters had been collected for scientific study. You see, we imagined that undersea farming would be required to feed all of the monsters. I very much wanted to explore that idea, but because of financial constraints, I was not allowed to do so. Only the idea of an island of monsters survived.
This film came out less than a year before Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, and Honda envisioned, as many people at that time did, that mankind would have already established a base on the moon by the end of the century, and that space travel would be commonplace. And all these futuristic scientific endeavors are being undertaken, in typical optimistic Ishiro Honda style, by the cooperative efforts of the International United Nations team. The script's major weakness is that the motivation for the alien invasion is never revealed. The aliens just kind of come and take us over, apparently just because they're bad guys, or girls in this case. It's a little bit too simplistic.
You have to unplug your brain a little bit and enjoy the ride. This film really doesn't withstand a lot of close scrutiny. The plot is basically a rehash of Invasion of Astro Monster, aka Monster Zero. The aliens take control of Toho's monsters and threaten to annihilate the Earth unless it surrenders. And in the end, the Earth's monsters are freed from alien control and they battle King Ghidorah to save the world. Astro Monster is the superior film simply because the Planet X aliens are far more interesting villains. Right here, take a look at the UNSC headquarters. This building is a real building, though it's been augmented here by matte paintings. It's now the city offices for the Meguro district of Tokyo, but it originally was the Chiyoda Life Insurance Company building.
And here we have the UN Command Center with its multiple video monitors. Both this and the Ogasawara control room probably look very quaint today, but back in 1968, this readily passed for a plausible look at future technology.
Just getting back to the difference between this and Astro Monster, The aliens in the prior film have a motivation for taking over the Earth. They need water, and they have a personality. The controller with his strange mannerisms, and the alien agent who looks like a Yakuza thug. And they're ruse about borrowing the monsters and buying up the buzzing alarm to protect themselves from the sound that destroys them. You can say it's all silly, but it's also fun and imaginative. And this movie hits the same note over and over again: surrender or we'll destroy you. And that's about all the Keylocks have to say. We don't know anything about them. There's a brief mention of wanting to create a scientific civilization, but why did they leave their own planet? The Keylocks aren't in the movie that much also, and so overall they're not a terribly effective villain. Actually, the best villain in the film is Dr. Otani, and he's killed off before the 30-minute mark. The Keylocks remind me a little bit of the Venusian women in Queen of Outer Space. Maybe they just need the love of men again, and they'll stop their intergalactic conquests. Now, this story is really an outline connecting a number of really great special effects sequences, and of course including every monster under the sun was a brilliant stroke. One can draw parallels between this film and House of Frankenstein from Universal in 1944, which was also one of the last hurrahs of a once brilliant series of films, and which also compensated for lack of story depth with an abundance of monsters.
Here's one of the scenes that always piques people's curiosity. Why is it Gorosaurus tunneling up through the ground and destroying the Arc de Triomphe? A lot of Japanese sources say that this was supposed to be Baragon, that the original script had his name in it, but they changed to Gorosaurus for filming. Most accounts say that the Baragon suit was either unavailable or in too poor shape to perform the scene, and I recently found another book that claims that they decided against Baragon because the ears made it too difficult for them to perform the scene. But oddly enough, it's hard to find any staff member to back any of this up, and the storyboards for the film have Gorosaurus drawn into the scene rather than Baragon. And furthermore, art director Inoue's preliminary set designs, which were drawn up prior to the start of filming, also list Gorosaurus as appearing in this scene.
And then, of course, the newscaster further confuses the matter by identifying the monster as Baragon.
Well, this is the first and only time that Godzilla ever appeared in America, and fittingly, he destroys the UN building, which in this vision of the future is the equivalent of attacking the world seat of power, since the UN seems to be in charge of everything. The set was built in perspective, with the real UN building being about 3 times Godzilla's actual size, but this set was made so that it was actually about 1/4 of that scale, and the rest of the distant New York skyline, such as the Chrysler building, is built even smaller. Toho Studios had its own star system, not unlike the major Hollywood studios, and its mainstream commercial movies featured some of the biggest movie stars of the 1950s and 60s. But when it came to casting science fiction films, director Honda preferred not to necessarily use big stars, but familiar faces, actors who were considered to be part of what was then known as the Honda family. Honda used many of the same people, both in leading roles and background parts, but his longtime assistant director Seiji Tani told us that it wasn't just a matter that Honda liked these people. Practically speaking, it was easier to make this kind of film with all its unique demands on the actors if the actors and director were already familiar with one another.
Akira Kubo, who plays the heroic astronaut Katsuo Yamabe in this film, was one of the most recognizable stars of Toho science fiction films, and he appeared in many other films as well, including Throne of Blood and Sanjuro for director Akira Kurosawa. Kubo started acting back in junior high school when he appeared in an educational film for the director Seiji Maruyama. And in 1953, when he was about 17, he starred in Ishiro Honda's 4th feature film, Adolescence Part 2. And this was one of a number of adolescent dramas produced by the Japanese studios in the early 50s in response to the popularity of a 1950 Italian film, Tomorrow is Too Late, with Vittorio De Sica and Pier Angeli.
Kubo was excellent in Adolescence Part 2 as a high school student who goes a little too far with a female classmate and a scandal erupts in their little mountain town. And in 1954, Kubo starred in the first film adaptation of Yukio Mishima's The Sound of the Waves, and that's the film that really launched his career. As far as sci-fi and fantasy films, Kubo was never really typecast. He played a number of different types of roles, though his characters are usually easygoing and affable. One of his best roles is in Matango, also known as Attack of the Mushroom People, where he was the lone survivor of a group of castaways.
And here's our hero now. In this film, Kubo seems to be deliberately playing a rough and tough all-action guy, quick with a gun and with a fist. It's a bit more of an action hero character than we usually see in Honda's films, most of which follow a group of protagonists who react to the monsters rather than driving the action themselves. And it's also a bit difficult to assess Kubo's acting here because all the characters, except perhaps Otani, who's killed off fairly early, are really one-dimensional. There's really not a lot for the actors to work with. Here, Kubo turns in a spirited performance, if not exactly a subtle or interesting one. By way of comparison, in Invasion of Astro Monster, Kubo played the nerdy inventor with an inferiority complex. He wants to marry his girlfriend, but her tough guy astronaut brother doesn't approve. And in Son of Godzilla, he's a reporter who infiltrates a top-secret scientific mission, and he has to humiliate himself washing dishes and cooking the meals so the scientists don't kick him out. Neither one of those roles is exactly Shakespeare, but at least those characters are humanized a bit, whereas most everyone in this film is a type, not really a character. In the 1990s, Kubo returned to the genre with a cameo in Gamera Guardian of the Universe. Well, here's a prediction for the future that Toho actually got right: Skype. Although we didn't have it in 1999. This is Dr. Yoshida, the head of the United Nations Scientific Committee, and he's played by the great character actor Jun Tazaki, who should be quite familiar to anyone who's a fan of Toho's sci-fi films. Tazaki usually plays either an authority figure or a villain, and he's equally good at both because he projects a very no-nonsense persona. He played a lot of parts for director Honda, and probably the best of these was the role of Jinguji, the nationalist World War II naval commander, who invents a flying submarine and uses it to rescue Japan from an invasion by the undersea kingdom of Mu, and that was in the film Atragon.
Tazaki's always been one of my favorites, and he's particularly good in the 1962 film Gorath as the captain of a spaceship on a doomed mission to save the Earth from an asteroid collision. He's great in Godzilla vs. Mothra as the gruff newspaper editor, and in Invasion of Astro Monster as Dr. Sakurai, the head of the World Space Authority. And he's also head of a terrorist organization in Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster. Like so many other actors in these films, this is only a very narrow sample of his body of work. Tazaki started acting in the late 1940s, and he was in well over 100 films, including many now that are considered as classics. Kurosawa's Gate of Hell, Kurosawa's High and Low, Inagaki's Chushingura, Masaki Kobayashi's Kwaidan, to name just a few. Tazaki would have been about 57 at the time Destroy All Monsters was made. He was born in 1910 and died in 1985. Katsuo's girlfriend, Kyoko Manabe, is played by a newcomer to the Toho science fiction genre, Yukiko Kobayashi. During the late 60s, as the Japanese film industry went into a state of decline, the old long-term contract system, which was modeled after the Hollywood system, was phased out, and a lot of famous actors, as well as directors and studio crew members, either left Toho or were let go, and the studios started to replace them with young new talent. That's one reason why some Toho films of the later 60s feature younger actors who are starting to break in rather than the veterans, and it might be why this role was given to Kobayashi rather than one of the more famous actresses that usually played this type of role, such as Kumi Mizuno or Yuriko Hoshi, or even Miyahama. Kobayashi was born in October 1946, making her just 21 when this film was made, and she's the daughter of Michitaro Mizushima, a famous actor who started back in the silent film era, and among many other films, starred in Underworld Beauty for director Seijun Suzuki. Her mother, Kurumi Yamamoto, was also an actress. Kobayashi made her film debut with a tiny part as a waitress in Ishiro Honda's Come Marry Me in 1967, a romantic drama that was in fact Honda's last non-science fiction picture. This appears to be one of her bigger film roles. Kobayashi was under contract at Toho in the late 60s and played numerous small roles in films, including two of the Young Guy films with Yuzo Koyama. As for science fiction, she had a big role as an android girl in an episode of Tsuburaya Productions' Ultra 7 in 1967, and she also co-starred as a native girl in Honda's 1970 film Space Amoeba. Kobayashi also did a lot of TV work in the late 60s and 70s, but appears to have retired around 1974. Recently, she recorded a DVD audio commentary for the 1970 Toho film Vampire Doll, in which she co-starred and gave a very creepy performance.
And she actually gives two different performances in this film. As Katsuo's girlfriend in the beginning and the end, she doesn't show much of a personality at all. She's dressed in rather uninteresting uniform, and she doesn't get much to do in those scenes. though near the end of the film she reflexively pleads with Katsuo not to go after the aliens, which is what all heroes' girlfriends are supposed to do. However, in the scenes when she's possessed by the key locks, such as right here, she's transformed. Her hairstyle goes from wavy to straight and sleek, rather modern looking for the times, and her fashion sense is bolder. Yeah, you have to love the scene where she's wearing the gold pumps and the white stockings and gloves, and her personality becomes ice cold and steely. And then, after she's freed from alien control, she gets her old hairstyle and boring clothes back. Kyoko's a potentially very interesting villain because we, the audience, we really don't want to dislike her. It would have been nice to see the script go a little further with this to make her even more of a femme fatale and try to seduce Katsuo to the dark side. Honda's films have had a number of great female villains: Atragon, Invasion of Astro Monster, King Kong Escapes, Terror of Mechagodzilla, but the best of these were conflicted about their evil ways. Kyoko has a lot of possibilities, but the film doesn't really go there. During the making of Destroy All Monsters, a number of Kobayashi's male co-stars, including Akira Kubo, were apparently hitting on her, but she rejected their advances. She liked all of her castmates, and she remembers in particular Yoshio Tsuchiya, Dr. Otani, entertaining the cast by playing the guitar during lunch breaks. In an interview published in Japan in 2011, she said her father raised her like a boy, dressed her in boys' clothes, gave her boys' toys, cut her hair short. Hard to believe seeing her here. She had no inkling of becoming an actress until she was a teen, when she met an executive from Toho by chance at a wedding, and he invited her to join the Toho Actors Studio. Well, in this scene we meet the Queen of the Key Locks, who is played by Kyoko Ai, who was more of a TV star and a singer than a film actress. She was born in 1943 in Osaka and made her acting debut in 1965 in the Asahi TV series The Symbol of Evil, and her popularity in that show landed her the lead in another series, Goodbye to the Storm, in 1966, playing a beautiful femme fatale, one of her most famous roles. She also sang that show's theme song and subsequently made her debut as a recording artist on Toshiba Records. She had a string of hit singles beginning in 1966 with titles that roughly translate as Lie, Lie, It's a Lie, and Don't Kiss Me Goodbye. And she continued releasing singles through 1969, and many of her records are now said to be considered collector's items. One show she starred in, The Newlywed, is where she met director Ishiro Honda, who directed a couple of episodes, and ultimately this led to her role in this film. Her co-stars in The Newlywed incidentally included Akira Takarada, the star of the original Godzilla, and Yoshio Tsuchiya, who's playing Dr. Otani in this film, right here on the right. Kyoko Ai made her film debut in one of Toho's Ekimae, or station front, comedies in 1967. She doesn't have a lot of film roles, and this is in fact her only science fiction film.
Fans of this genre will also recognize some of the other actors in smaller parts. One of the Monsterland staff in the background of this scene is Susumu Kurobe, who was the star of Ultraman, the Tsuburaya Productions television show that was broadcast just a year or so before this film came out. Kenji Sahara, who starred in Rodan for Honda and had great roles in many films, and who was a star of another TV show for Tsuburaya Productions, Ultra Q, takes a small role here as a commander of the moon base.
And you'll see him in the moon base scenes talking on the microphone and wearing one of those red service station type uniforms. It's a little surprising to see some of these well-known actors in smaller roles, but it also reflects the fact that they were part of the Honda family and would appear regularly in Honda's films.
Dr. Otani, the head of the Monsterland Research Center, who becomes the Key Lock spokesman and later dies courtesy of a rather unconvincing dummy hurtling out of a hotel window, he's played by the great Yoshio Tsuchiya, who has enjoyed an eclectic movie career and is quite an eclectic personality himself. You may already know that Tsuchiya is fascinated by UFOs and claims to have seen a number of them in his lifetime. Tsuchiya had relatively little professional experience when he burst on the scene in Kurosawa's Seven Samurai in 1954 as a tormented farmer whose wife is kidnapped by the bandits. It's a tense and on-the-edge performance, and since then, he's always said he prefers playing unusual or twisted characters.
And Tsuchiya says that he first met director Honda during the making of Seven Samurai, during a period when Tsuchiya was living at Kurosawa's home. Ishiro Honda was a frequent visitor. Honda and Kurosawa, of course, having been friends since the 1930s when they trained together as assistant directors. And Tsuchiya says that Kurosawa wouldn't allow him to work for second-rate directors, but, quote, he said that if Honda was making it, then it must be a good movie, and he allowed me to appear in those films, unquote. Far and away, Tsuchiya gives the best performance in this movie. Just look at the contrast between his opening scene where he's giving Kyoko a friendly tour of the Monsterland control room and his later scenes where he's essentially a tormented automaton. Look at the intensity in his face in the scene where he's taken prisoner and during the car ride to the interrogation. He doesn't even need dialogue to create an interesting character. And here are those wonderful gold pumps. This is the first science fiction film where Honda worked with veteran cinematographer Taiichi Kankura, though the two men had worked together before. Hajime Koizumi, who had shot more than 20 pictures for Honda dating back to the 1950s, including some of his dramatic films, and who was largely responsible for the look of Honda's films, left Toho Studios after King Kong Escapes in 1967. Kankura had been shooting films since the 1940s. One of his earliest was a war picture with effects directed by Tsuburaya. In 1952, he shot Honda's drama about whaling, The Man Who Came to Port, and Kankura spent months on a whaling vessel shooting documentary footage that was utilized in that film.
Honda was well known for his simple and direct use of the camera, avoiding a lot of movement and unusual angles and setups. While not exactly pushing the envelope, the composition of this interrogation scene with Kubo and Tazaki framed through the decorative partition exemplifies the more unusual camera setups that Kankura tried to inject. Kankura's work also seemed geared more towards showing off the actors in straight-on close-ups, good for making the actors look more attractive, but not so good for maintaining story continuity through camera angles.
It may or may not be Kankura's doing, but Destroy All Monsters has a bit of a claustrophobic feel due to the fact that most of the movie takes place in crowded or cramped interiors or in caves, the underground bunker on Monsterland, the war room inside the rocket, the Keylog base, the press conferences, and so on. Other than some brief establishing shots on the beach and in Tokyo and at Mount Fuji, the film really has little in the way of outdoor scenes other than the monster battle at the end, but that really doesn't count because it's a miniature set. We mentioned earlier that director Ishiro Honda would have turned 100 years old in 2011. In recent years, Honda's work has begun to receive something of a critical reappraisal in the West, thanks primarily to the 2004 theatrical release of the original Gojira. He's been known exclusively as a science fiction director, but it's really just one facet of his career, so we want to talk a little bit about his background.
Ishiro Honda was born in 1911 in the small village of Asahimura in Yamagata Prefecture, a rural area in the northwest part of the island of Honshu. Asahimura was an agricultural community, a place where something like movies was completely unknown. But his father, a Buddhist monk, took a job at a temple in Tokyo when Honda was 10, and it was in Tokyo that he was introduced to movies. The bug for making movies bit him when he saw several films being shot in the city, and he fixated on the person who was in charge, which he found out was called the director. During the 1930s, he apprenticed at PCL Studios under Kojiro Yamamoto, one of Toho's most prominent directors, and during this time he forged a lifelong and deep friendship with another trainee by the name of Akira Kurosawa.
Honda's career was delayed for years by war. Beginning in January 1936, he was drafted into the Japanese military 3 times over a period of 8 years, serving multiple tours of duty in Japanese-occupied China. While his contemporaries advanced and were promoted to director, Kurosawa among them, Honda was away from the studio for long periods. He was a pacifist at heart, and the war experience profoundly affected him, but Honda's overriding thought was that he wanted to return to Japan and make movies. After the war, he did return, and he worked as an assistant for his mentor Yamamoto, then for Kurosawa, shooting sequences for the 1949 film Stray Dog, and for the great director Mikio Naruse. Eventually, Honda wrote and directed his first feature film in 1951 for Toho, The Blue Pearl, which is a wonderful yet forgotten love story set in a community of pearl divers in the beautiful Ise-Shima area. His first true special effects film was in 1953, Eagle of the Pacific, the story of the reluctant soldier Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, and it was a huge hit. A year later, he was offered the director's chair for Godzilla, and that's, of course, the film that would define his career.
Under the system that had developed at Toho, science fiction and fantasy films had 2 directors, each in charge of separate crews, one for the dramatic sequences and another for special effects. Special effects man Eiji Tsuburaya was difficult for many directors to work with, but he and Honda developed a great sense of teamwork, and that was the primary reason why Toho Studios assigned Honda to direct science fiction films more and more. Because he had a strong interest in science, Honda was able to use science fiction as a medium for his message of peace. And Honda thrived in this genre for more than a decade, but at a certain point, he started to feel a bit pigeonholed. Honda never really publicly expressed his frustration about this period, but privately he did talk about his desire to do more than simplistic monster movies, and we'll go into that a little bit more in our book.
In 1992, writer David Milner interviewed Ishiro Honda and asked him what sort of projects he would have liked to make if given the chance. Here's a clip from that interview and of Honda's answer. Interestingly, he doesn't mention a desire to make more monster movies.
There were a few canceled projects, but they weren't science fiction films. One that was being planned was The Fisherman. It was going to be a semi-documentary about fishermen living in Okinawa. I wrote a synopsis, but Toho canceled the project. The story, which was about the younger generation wanting to leave Okinawa for the big city, eventually got out and was produced as a documentary by another studio. Another canceled project was a Japanese version of those magnificent men in their flying machines. Mr. Tsuburaya had also planned to work on such a movie. I interviewed many of the pioneers of Japanese aviation, and a script was completed. I'm not sure if the project was canceled for financial reasons, or if it was canceled simply because Toho decided against producing the film. A third movie I originally was going to work on was a Japanese version of Ghost.
The old farmer who finds the transmitter in the river is played by Ikyo Sawamura, a great character actor whose career spanned from the 1940s until the 70s. He's so memorable, even in the little parts he usually plays, because his animated expressions are so great. You might remember him as the Mondo Island native in King Kong Escapes, or as the mute alien lackey in Terror of Mechagodzilla. He died in 1975 at age 70. By the time of Destroy All Monsters, Ishiro Honda's career had changed considerably. In the late 50s, he was busy making dramas and comedies, a biopic of a baseball player. Monster movies were just one facet. But after 1965, Honda was no longer working under a guaranteed studio contract. Due to changes in the industry, many longtime studio directors were now essentially guns for hire. And the only films Toho would hire Honda to work on anymore were science fiction. The last non-genre film he made for Toho was Come Marry Me, which is about a rich young man who falls for a girl from the wrong side of the tracks. Kurosawa encouraged Honda to go the independent route, as Kurosawa had done, and to develop his own projects and make them at other studios. But Honda was loyal to Toho, and even as the business deteriorated, he stayed on to make All Monsters Attack, a.k.a. Godzilla's Revenge, and he finally walked away from Toho after Space Amoeba in 1970. The death of Eiji Tsuburaya in January 1970, in addition to the general erosion of the genre and the industry, may have contributed to Honda's decision to finally leave. The reporter in this scene, and also in the earlier scene with the broadcasts from the rampages around the world, is Saburo Iketani, who was a real-life newscaster, and he essentially played himself in many Toho films. And also in this scene is the distinguished-looking Caucasian United Nations delegate who's played by Andrew Hughes, an Australian businessman living in Tokyo who carved out a second career appearing in many movies dating back to the 1950s. Of all the foreign, non-professional actors seen in Japanese movies at that time, Hughes was one of the most recognizable, and he even played Hitler in one Japanese comedy film.
While this is supposed to be 30 years in the future, Tokyo doesn't really look drastically different than it did in 1968. That's not necessarily a bad thing, since it helps the audience to relate to the events a little better, but there are still enough futuristic details, such as this portable TV, that make the audience buy into the futuristic setting. One subtle touch, which is seldom noticed by viewers, is the clothing on the detectives. Notice that their suits don't have lapels. Looks like another one of those things that didn't quite get right about the future.
Screenwriter Kimura reportedly had a grudge against police dating back to his communist days when he was hassled by the authorities. Ishiro Honda said Kimura liked to make the police look stupid in his scripts, and he sure does that here.
Incidentally, when pictures of the Ogasawara personnel still under Keylak control are displayed on the portable TV screen, each one's name is actually a variation on the respective actors' real names. One kanji character in each name was changed, so Susumu Kurobe was changed to Susumu Kuroiwa. Minoru Ito became Minoru Kudo, and so on. And they also mentioned that one of the people to look out for is Andrew Hughes, an American citizen. In his case, they just changed his nationality rather than his name.
Well, that's kind of interesting because Andrew Hughes is with the UN and he's not working for the Keylocks, so he was accused of a crime he didn't commit. Well, now we're coming up on the first really big special effects sequence and the only urban destruction sequence in the film, and in fact it would be the last large-scale city destruction scene in any Toho giant monster film until Terror of Mechagodzilla a few years later. One of the stars of this sequence is a monster that didn't receive a proper introduction at the film's opening, and that's Manda, the giant sea serpent from Honda's Atragon. These scenes of Kyoko in the future Tokyo, seemingly directing the monster attack with that evil smile, this really hints at what we talked about earlier, the potential in this character for a really, really good villain that is largely unexplored.
Now, as Godzilla comes ashore, notice that there's a construction crane lying on the ground. Watch what Godzilla does. He picks his foot up and sort of steps over it. Only recently did Haruo Nakajima notice that he did that. Thinking back on the scene, he's certain that he did it in order to make sure that he didn't trip over the model and fall, making a major no-good take. But now he regrets that he did such an unmonster-like action, because as a monster, he should have just kicked it out of the way. This brings us to one of the film's real showstoppers, which is Manda wrapping itself around the monorail and then crushing it as Godzilla plows through the dock area and sets fire to it in the background. This is an unforgettable image. This is Manda's big moment, the scene which typifies how Arakawa and his crew had taken what they had learned from Tsuburaya and moved on to do things that he wanted to do, but was never able to. Previously, wireworks could only be used to create straight line movement, but now they had advanced to creating curved lines and movement with much more depth. Cut by cut, the positioning and angle of the pulling of wires was changed, but when edited together, Manda seemed to curl around the structure with little effort until the scene culminates in the simultaneous destruction by both monsters. It's not very well known, but when this scene was originally shot, Godzilla and Manda actually engage each other in battle. In the 1990s, Toho dug out unused special effects footage from its archives and released this particular scene to home video. Manda is wrapped around a skyscraper as Godzilla is walking past, trashing some buildings, and when the skyscraper collapses, Manda and Godzilla tangle as the army continues to attack. Visually, it's very impressive, and I like that this is consistent with the idea that rather than the aliens strictly controlling their every actions, the monsters are actually just being guided to do what comes naturally, which is to destroy. But if their paths were to cross, they would just as easily attack each other as they would mankind. These are perhaps the best missile launching seen in a Toho film, as the projectiles rise straight up into the air without a wobble, following a true flight path. The usual technique was to guide missiles upwards with piano wires, but this time the missiles were propelled by using springs to increase their speed. The launching platform used a soft material to hold the springs in place, and when gunpowder in the missile ignited, this soft material melted and released a spring, rapidly launching the missiles skyward and leaving a smoke trail behind. I guess the people of the future didn't really trust the facility on Ogasawara Island to keep the monsters under control, since they still keep rocket launchers hidden inside some of their buildings.
Nakajima has fond memories of this particular sequence. He said, quote, "I still like that kind of scene. I can't remember another Godzilla movie where Godzilla was attacked as much as he is here. There were so many tracer bullets, so many explosions. The explosions aren't anything to be afraid of as long as you know from rehearsal where they are and in which order they're coming." Unquote. Nakajima said the challenge of a scene like this is all the smoke that limited his view and made it hard to breathe. All the other monsters in this scene were wired controlled, so Nakajima was the only monster actor on the set.
Director Ishiro Honda often liked to give the suit actors a chance to be seen on screen in cameos during the drama, and in this film, there are multiple scenes where Haruo Nakajima can be seen playing an officer at the conference table.
And for those who don't recognize him immediately, Nakajima in these scenes is the man kind of in the forefront of the table with a little bit of a receding hairline.
Others which can be glimpsed in the military scenes are Seiji Onaka, who played Godzilla in Son of Godzilla, Masashi Shinohara, who played Rodan throughout the 60s, Tokyo Okawa, who had performed in suits such as the Meganeuron from Rodan, and a Mushroom Man in Matango. Honda returned to direct Terror of Mechagodzilla for Toho in 1975, but afterwards he retired from filmmaking until his friend Akira Kurosawa asked him to help out on Kagemusha in 1979. Honda gladly welcomed the opportunity, and he collaborated on 5 films with Kurosawa before he died on February 28, 1993. Honda's chief assistant director on this film was Seiji Tani, who had worked with Honda on various projects since 1957. We interviewed Tani for our book, and he offered some good insights into the man and his work. He said, quote, "He was a really serious person, but also a gentleman. As a movie director, they all have different personalities, some are scary, but he was nothing like that. His descriptions were very clear, easy for everyone to understand. As a human being, he was a straight shooter. He didn't use fancy techniques much. Of course, everyone's different, but he was the same way from start to finish. He directed his films with solid intentions and aims. There are times in life when things go opposite from the way you want them to go. However, he never got flustered, and this is not something everyone can do so easily, especially on the set. A director is pressured and demanded to make decisions on the spot. It was obvious that he was making the right decisions, oftentimes holding back his own emotions. Again, this is a very hard thing to do." End quote.
The military general with the narrow mustache, that's Yoshibumi Tajima, whom you might remember as Kumiyama, the great entrepreneur in Mothra vs. Godzilla, another great Toho contract player of the 1950s and 60s who appeared in a broad range of movies. Science fiction was just a small part of his work. Tajima's relationship with director Honda goes all the way back to 1956 when he appeared in Honda's short film Night School. Then he also appeared in Honda's Rodan that same year. He was a fine actor when given a role to sink his teeth into, but in science fiction films that was rather rare. This is a memorable scene and somewhat shocking where Katsuo rips off Kyoko's earrings, leaving her with a bloody lobe. This might be the most violent of Honda's science fiction films overall. There's certainly a lot of gunplay, though it's not depicted realistically. Earlier, one of the Monsterland staffers gets shot in the head, and the expression on his face makes it seem like it's played for laughs, which is kind of odd. Eiji Tsuburaya, the acknowledged pioneer of the Japanese special effects field, gets top billing as special effects supervisor in this film, but his longtime cameraman Sadamasa Arikawa was promoted to the special effects director's chair here. Arikawa became an effects director in 1966 for the first time with Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster. At that time, Toho began splitting the directing chores for special effects films between Arikawa and Tsuburaya. And Tsuburaya had formed his own production company just a few years earlier, and he was spending more and more time producing the monster shows for television. And as we mentioned, these shows were stealing viewers away from Toho films. It's widely speculated, and probably with good reason, that Toho was unhappy with Tsuburaya for doing his own thing and using a lot of Toho resources in the process. Regardless of the reason, Arikawa got his opportunity to direct at this time, and rather than simply copy the work of his mentor, he carved out his own niche. Arikawa challenged himself and his staff to take what they had learned from Tsuburaya and do things they could not or had not done before.
Now, Arikawa got his start as a special effects man somewhat by accident. He was a fighter pilot in World War II, and after the war, he worked at Toho in the sound recording department for a couple of years, but the job really didn't interest him. But while working at Toho, he asked to meet the cameraman who shot a film he saw during the war called Scramble of Raigeki Troop. That cameraman was Eiji Tsuburaya, who told him that the battle footage of the film wasn't real. It was actually miniature special effects, something which Arikawa had never even heard of. Tsuburaya and Arikawa had a mutual love of aviation, and they hit it off pretty well, talking all night until the sun came up. And just as Arikawa was about to leave, Tsuburaya asked him to join his staff. Just like everybody who worked for Tsuburaya in those early days, Arikawa had to be taught everything, down to the smallest details. In one of his last interviews, Arikawa talked about learning from Tsuburaya. He said, quote, "Because of my war experience, I had my stupid pride as a pilot. So when we were working on Eagle of the Pacific, I actually spoke up as a pilot saying, shouldn't it be more this way? And he just plain told me, shut up and do what I say. So I worked as he told me to, and with the grumpiest look on my face. But later, the film was finished and I saw it, and only then did I completely understand what he was trying to do. That was the time I realized that there really was no mistake if I just listened and did what he said. After being trained by Tsuburaya for almost 20 years, Arakawa's shift from cameraman to director was, in his words, the best time of his life, but his style of working was different from that of Tsuburaya. Whereas Tsuburaya was always hands-on, fiddling with the set, inspecting miniatures, and so on, Arakawa often stood back and let his people do their jobs. Until it came time for filming, he was seldom on the set. Crew members who were accustomed to Tsuburaya's ways didn't appreciate working for Arakawa as much, but Arakawa didn't take his staff's work for granted. Reflecting back on his work, he said, quote, "Back then, I really thought I was doing my job as a director very well, but I look back on that time now and really feel that my work was all supported by the staff. Everybody, each person, they all were important. After all, the director is only someone who puts everyone's work together," end quote.
Well, here's an interesting little tidbit. In the spring of 1968, while Destroy All Monsters was in production, the Imperial Theatre of London was staging a production of the musical Oliver in Tokyo. And one of the play's child stars, identified only as Michael in the program book, was a big Godzilla fan and he wanted to visit Toho, but he couldn't because his commitment to the play wouldn't allow him. So instead, Toho surprised him with a visit from the monsters and actress Yukiko Kobayashi, who helped translate for him. The Japanese program for Destroy All Monsters shows a photo of this lucky kid with Godzilla and Miss Kobayashi.
Toho's optical department under Sadao Iizuka and Tadashi Kawana handled all of the effects animations such as the rays, the glowing of Godzilla's fins, force fields, and so on. In addition to these usual effects, they also had to fully animate the fire dragon at the climax, which was no small task. In this film, there's several scenes where Godzilla's ray curves somewhat unnaturally, sort of arcing upwards. The obvious explanation is that the angle of the monster's jaw didn't line up with the resulting explosion, so rather than draw the ray at a bizarre angle, this compromise was made. But recently, another explanation has been offered, that Godzilla's ray was purposely animated in perspective, rising up as it extends away from the monster due to its extreme heat. I have a hard time believing that this was their intention all along, but I suppose it's a nice rationalization.
Here's another technological advance that Honda predicted accurately: drone warfare. Other than the SY-3, it looks as if the military forces fighting the monsters are all remote-controlled. Both the military vehicles here and the rocket launchers that were seen earlier in the film, they're all remote-controlled. Apparently somebody finally realized that when you deploy troops against giant monsters, you're going to suffer severe casualties. Honda regular Hisaya Ito is one of the guys in charge of the mechanized forces here. But the Kilak's specialty is remote control, and they easily jam the military's frequency, so remote-controlled warfare has its limitations too, apparently.
I love how this film keeps piling the monsters on unexpectedly, one-upping the audience in the middle of an already exciting scene. Here it looks like the army has to contend with Godzilla guarding the Kilak base, and suddenly Anguilla shows up to make it a total rout. Likewise with Godzilla, Rodan, and Manda trashing Tokyo, it seems like that's already enough, but then Mothra shows up to add insult to injury. And of course at the end, you not only get King Ghidorah coming out of nowhere to fight on behalf of the Kilaks, but after he's defeated, then the Fire Dragon comes on the scene. As a viewer, you're on the edge of your seat thinking, well, what's coming next?
The SY-3 rocket is another one of the stars of the movie. It gets so much screen time. It's an unusual design, and it looks like a cross between a rocket and a giant fighter plane. All the futuristic or speculative hardware you see in Toho films, from weaponry to vehicles to aircraft, is the work of the special effects art staff. In the case of the SY-3, it was designed by the fertile imagination of the late Mutsumi Toyoshima. Toyoshima joined Toho in 1959 and originally worked as a set builder, but because he was skilled at drawing blueprints, he was promoted to the position of designer, starting with the war film I Bombed Pearl Harbor in 1960.
Toyoshima loved all kinds of vehicles, and science fiction gave him an opportunity to do what he liked most, which was to create something that no one had seen before. His most famous creations were the Maser cannons from War of the Gargantuas, the Black Shark submarine in Latitude Zero, and the SY-3 in this film. With the SY-3, he created Toho's most memorable spaceship and one that accurately predicted the use of booster rockets. Here's an excerpt from a 2003 interview where Toyoshima talks about designing the SY-3.
I would often refer to NASA designs for making my blueprints more realistic. It was my practice to gather a lot of information whenever I had something new to design. One of my favorite reference sources was Popular Science magazine. I think that the SY-3 is probably the best work I've ever done. I used the image of a U.S. military airship as a basis, the kind of plane which was launched from an aircraft carrier. And for the booster engine, I used one of NASA's ideas for that. I thought that to propel it to the moon, the booster section would have to be around 3 times the length of the SY-3 itself. NASA still uses that booster concept today with the space shuttle.
Using Toyoshima's designs, the model crew made the ship in 3 different scales. The largest was 1 meter long, used mainly for shots of the ship flying across the surface of the moon, landing and taking off, and for the battle with the fire dragon. The core of the model was solid wood, with surface details made of balsa wood and molded fiberglass, with putty and paint used to disguise the wood grain and the seams. This model had collapsible wings, functional landing gear, and fully firing engines. A 50-centimeter version was made for use with the booster stage, and a 30-centimeter model was made for perspective flying shots. The smaller models were both made of balsa wood covered with putty and paint. Because Toho special effects films have 2 separate crews, they had to coordinate to make sure that their footage meshed seamlessly. A big part of this was detailed storyboarding. Both sides need to know what it would look like when their footage was edited together, so the assistant directors from each team would compare their storyboards on a daily basis. Eyeline was the key point for the drama side. Where was the monster located? How was it moving across the frame? If you make a mistake, almost nothing could save a shot. Special effects script supervisor Keiko Suzuki, who worked on most of the 60s films, said that in these daily meetings the drama team would actually bring a frame or 2 of the original camera negatives from the end of each take from the previous day, so that the special effects team could see exactly what the eyelines were in various shots. There are several scenes in Destroy All Monsters where this was particularly important. When Godzilla is chasing down the military search teams, there's numerous optical shots combining footage shot by the drama and effects crew. There are also some interesting camera angles during that sequence, like the point of view shot from behind Godzilla's head looking down on the men scattering on the ground.
Well, Arikawa's work does have a few recognizable riffs or techniques. More so than Tsuburaya, Arikawa sometimes lets the camera become part of the action, particularly during the monster battles. For instance, the camera placement is sometimes at the monster's shoulder height, right in the thick of the fight, as opposed to watching from a distance. It's powerful, but it also compromises the illusion of size, because you're standing right next to Godzilla instead of looking up into the sky at it. My personal favorite Arikawa moment is in Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, where Godzilla's radiation breath is blasted right into the lens. There's a similar scene in this movie near the end when the fire dragon bears down on Godzilla and the monster blasts it with its breath.
Arikawa's signature is his mastery over wireworks effects, especially with all the insect monsters in Son of Godzilla. If you'd seen the rafters in the top of the sound stages where all the wireworks guys had to stand, you'd understand what a dangerous position it is. Balancing on a narrow wooden walkway at least 20 or 30 feet above the floor, manipulating 1 or more piano wires that could easily slice a finger off if not handled properly. These days, wires are controlled from ground level using overhead pulleys, but at that time many of the wire guys were situated up in the rafters. In Son of Godzilla in 1967, Arikawa and Wireworks crew chief Fumio Nakadai had Godzilla battling giant mantises and the giant spider Kumonga. Think of all the wires required to manipulate all those insect legs. In this movie, they took it a step further, with King Ghidorah landing and taking off, the heads more naturally manipulated than ever before, as many as 6 monsters at a time moving about, each with varying degrees of wire control.
Well, Arikawa had been at Toho since the beginning of his career, but in the late 60s he started taking jobs outside the studio. As Arikawa told us during an interview in 2000, Tsuburaya knew that film was declining and he felt Arikawa should prepare himself for the future by getting TV experience. After Tsuburaya's death, Arikawa returned to Toho one last time to direct the effects for Space Amoeba in 1970. A few years later, he would lead a team of Toho effects artists who worked on the Shaw Brothers production of Mighty Peking Man in Hong Kong, and in his later years, he taught filmmaking. Arikawa died in 2005 at age 80. This is another superb wirework scene. You have the miniature keylock base with people matted in, walking around, and then one saucer drops down into storage while the other takes off and flies through the tunnel. It's done so seamlessly, all in one cut and without overhead wires. The wires are all horizontally mounted, one set to the left and the other set down the tunnel. The miniature flying saucer was made from fiberglass resin and was 80 centimeters in diameter, so it was pretty hefty. The special effects crew picked up the saucer with wires from both sides and then pulled the horizontal wire into the tunnel with a winch, allowing the saucer to fly through the tunnel. The evolution of the Godzilla series from general audience films to children's films was really a business decision more than a creative one, an attempt to hold on to a changing and shrinking audience, and also it was a byproduct of major changes affecting the Japanese film industry in the 60s. The period from 1955 to 65, the decade called the Showa 30s, that was the peak of the Japanese film business in terms of box office and productivity. That was the golden age, but by 1965, ticket sales were declining fast. And because of Japan's post-war economic success, now everybody had a television, so they were staying home. But there were other factors too, and the changing taste of the audience, the popularity of imported films from overseas, and other factors. In 1971, to give you an idea how bad it was, the Daiei studio went into bankruptcy, and the Nikatsu studio reorganized as a maker of softcore erotic movies just in order to survive. Toho underwent major restructuring of its own, terminating many long-term contracts of directors and special effects crew, actors, and others. Just to give you an idea of this sea change that occurred, in 1958, the high point of the industry, there were 1.1 billion movie tickets sold in Japan. In 1969, the year after this film, that number had dropped by 75%. By the early 70s, the studios were undergoing drastic changes, diversifying into other businesses like bowling alleys, selling off studio property, and replacing older, highly paid executives with younger ones. And they were expanding into TV. In some ways, this situation mirrored the financial straits the Hollywood studios were going through around the same time.
Destroy All Monsters was made during this period when the Japanese movie business was contracting, and special effects films in particular were noticeably affected. Ticket sales for the Godzilla series had been steadily declining throughout the 60s, partly because of the popularity of monster-themed television programs produced by Eiji Tsuburaya himself and others. Then there was Gamera, the giant turtle that made its debut in 1965 at Daiei Studios. The Gamera movies were made expressly for children. Most of them starred kids as principal characters, something that the Toho films never really had. The influence of Gamera on the Godzilla series is probably something nobody at Toho would acknowledge, but it's undeniable. All Monsters Attack, also known as Godzilla's Revenge, which Honda directed in 1969, stars a child character for the first time, and the budget was kept to a minimum by rehashing stock footage from previous films for many of the monster scenes. And even Destroy All Monsters, despite being a relatively large production, shows symptoms of the cost-cutting measures of those times. There are a few bits of stock footage, such as the destruction shots inside the Monsterland headquarters, the birth of King Ghidorah, and a fireball from the last war. There's only one city destruction sequence, and even though there's a ton of monsters here, a number of them are actually old monster costumes and props that have been mothballed for years. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. In true Toho fashion, some of the props used in this film are borrowed from previous films, and likewise props from this film appear in subsequent films. The crew helmets for the SY-3 were originally made in yellow, as you can see here, but they were painted silver and reused several years later in Catastrophe 1999 as radiation protection gear. The pistols used by the SY-3 crew were actually the same ray guns carried by the Planet X people in Monster Zero, although the fork tipped on the front of the gun had to be removed to allow the guns to be holstered. There were two versions of this pistol, an electric one which fired blanks, and a non-functioning type. The Keelek pistols, which are seen when the aliens tried to snatch Dr. Otani's body, were later used by the Black Hole aliens in the two Mechagodzilla movies of the mid-70s.
Well, this movie takes a lot of liberties with science, obviously. By 1968, we knew that the surface of the moon didn't look like this, and in the next few scenes you'll see flames even though there's no atmosphere on the moon. Unlike in previous films where Honda would consult with scientists for plausibility, here he seems content to go with what looks good.
As the SY-3 descends into the Keelak base, the ship is about to fall into the fire trap set by the Keelaks. Arakawa's intention for this scene and later scenes of the Fire Dragon was to make effects where the audience can almost feel the heat. To pull that off, real flamethrowers were used in this scene. And this necessitated art director Yasuyuki Inoue to have the walls of the set constructed for the first time with fire-retardant materials, including asbestos, lest the whole set go up in flames. The result was a resounding success, and from this point forward, the effects crew adopted this technique to minimize the collateral damage from fire on sets where pyrotechnics were to be used. The landing and takeoff inside the Keelak base was done using the large model of SY-3. Since the ship had to drop into and later emerge from the crater, the set had to be built in more than a meter deep to conceal the ship, and several meters more of space above were needed to allow the ship to rise up and fly off without revealing the top of the set at the same time. Art director Yasuyuki Inoue, heard here in this archival interview, devised a rather unique solution to the problem.
When the SY-3 flies to the moon, there's a scene where it descends into the enemy alien base. We needed a hole that was 2 meters deep in order to fit the model of the ship. We could have built the surface of the moon 2 meters high, but that would mean the sky backdrop would have to be very small and it would make it very difficult to shoot the scene. So instead, we built the surface of the moon about 1.5 feet above the ground, and we dropped the rocket into a hole in the floor that was 2 meters deep. I knew the studio would never give me permission to dig a hole through the concrete studio floor, so I didn't even ask. After the shooting was finished, the studio found out about it, and I told them that I'd gotten permission. And they said, "From whom?" I pointed to myself. "I got permission from me. End of discussion." You've got to do what you got to do to realize your ideas. And you and I, Ed, were fortunate to shoot a documentary film featuring Mr. Inoue a few years ago. He really is an unsung hero of the genre.
Inoue joined Toho during the production of Godzilla in 1954 and took over as head of Tsuburai's art department in 1965, but he got into movies quite by accident. He was injured while serving in the Japanese Navy during the war and had a foot amputated. Desperate to find a way to support himself, he learned how to design furniture, then studied drafting, design, and architecture, skills that all came in handy when he fell into special effects work quite by accident. By the time this film was made, Toho was cutting budgets and reducing its staff. Inoue had an incredible work ethic, and he simply compensated by taking more duties upon himself. Inoue's work is everywhere in Destroy All Monsters. He designed the sets such as Monsterland, downtown Tokyo as seen in the Monster Rampage, the Monster Battlefield at Mount Fuji. These are all his doing. He created the blueprints, and then he had his special effects crew create everything. Looking at this scene where the commander orders radio silence as they await the outcome of the SY-3's mission, I strongly feel a touch of Ishiro Honda here. During the course of his 3 stints in the Japanese Army, covering almost 8 years, Honda served as an officer and recognized the agony of command, the concern he felt for the safety of his men. It's Honda's way to show an officer's natural concern for his charges.
We're coming up to the scene where the SY-3 crew dismantles the Keelak transmitter on the moon, and this scene's really a testament, I think, to the power of the music of the late composer Akira Ifukube, who was scoring his 6th Godzilla movie here in a career that included hundreds of film scores. Dramatically, this scene doesn't really work all that well. It's really all about the process rather than the human element. You see them taking out the ray gun, plugging it in, turning it on, their sweaty faces. There's really no human drama. It's like watching a tutorial about welding that goes on forever. And yet the scene sort of works because of Ifukube's driving, frantic music score, which creates dramatic tension where there really isn't any. Ifukube composed a number of great themes for this film, some of which borrow melodies from his previous scores. We've invited Akira Ifukube scholar Jim Figursky to join us briefly here to talk about the score. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks for having me.
Ifukube composed a lot of great music for this film, some of which has really interesting instrumentation, like the moon base theme. And he grabs you right from the start with that booming theme that accompanies the main title card at the beginning of the film, and then that riveting march that plays under the opening credits.
The title card theme is unique only to Destroy All Monsters, and I think it is a defining theme in this movie, even though it's only used twice. First time being in the beginning, and then the second time when Minya shows up. As far as the military march goes, the only other time it's used besides Destroy All Monsters was briefly in the 1991 movie Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. And I tend to like this military theme even a little more than some of the fan favorites, like the Frigate March from the original Godzilla. What I think sets this march apart from others, especially in the Showa era, is towards the end of it, Ifukube tends to pull back the brass section and he lets the strings through a little more, which is unusual since most marches concentrate very heavily on instruments from the brass family. The only other march in the Showa area that he did this for that I can think of off the top of my head is the one from Atragon. But in the Heisei series, he put this technique into practice quite a bit.
During the tour of Monsterland at the beginning of the film, when all the monsters are being introduced, the music there is really interesting. It's melancholy and foreboding. It conveys the awesome power of the monsters and the sadness of them being imprisoned. And there's a part of that theme that sounds like gothic horror music. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you bring that up because one day I was watching the Japanese version, and my wife, who's Japanese, she was in another room, and she could only hear the audio. And she asked me if this was a kid-oriented movie, because according to the narrator's dialogue, it was a bit childish, but the music was morbidly dark. Without the music, that particular scene might look like a kid's movie, but this is a testament to Ifukube's music being able to create the mood here, making it appear much more serious than what it really is.
The Battle Royale theme at the end of the film, incorporating themes of all the different monsters that are fighting, that's kind of an Ifukube staple. How do you think the battle theme for Destroy All Monsters stacks up against some of Ifukube's other works?
This is unfortunately one part of the movie that I felt like he was kind of phoning it in. We get the same combination of Rodan's theme, Godzilla's theme, King Ghidorah's theme, and they're all squeezed into this revolving medley. And while there's nothing wrong with that, for most Godzilla fans, this combination is definitely not the first time we've heard this before. But we kind of have to remember that Ifukube didn't have a lot of time, sometimes only 2 or 3 days, to compose for these movies. So we have to take that into consideration as well.
Well, thanks, Jim, very much for joining us. Destroy All Monsters was on television a lot during the 1970s and even into the 80s, but then it disappeared and became something of a lost film for a period of time. And then when it reappeared on home video and cable in the 1990s, something about it was different, at least to the discerning ears of those of us who grew up watching the film. When Destroy All Monsters was originally released by American International, the English language dialogue was recorded in New York by Tetra Sound Studios, a company that had been dubbing films since the 1950s. Tetra was located in a building just above Times Square, and the actors who performed the voices were professionals with stage and film and TV experience. In fact, at least 2 of the actors in the Tetra dub of this film are of some distinction. Hal Linden, who you may know as TV's Barney Miller or from those FYI infomercials in the 1980s, he plays the voice of the leading man, Katsuo, who's played by Akira Kubo on screen. And the narrator of the film, who starts everything off with that deep, rich voice, the year is 1999, that is Norman Rose, an actor and voiceover man who began back in the days of radio and who did lots of movies and TV. Back in the day, Tetra and its offshoot, Titan Productions, were where the voice tracks for many Japanese science fiction films and television shows were recorded. Ultraman, Johnny Sacco. In fact, the voice of Speed Racer, the late Peter Fernandez, was one of the studio's main actors and writers and directors. Fernandez directed the dubbing of this picture for AIP's version, and it was his version that we grew up watching and listening to. But again, when the film resurfaced, the dubbing was different and a bit inferior, both in terms of performance and the scripting of the English dialogue. Back in the 1960s and in the 70s, Toho commissioned English dialogue tracks for many of its science fiction films in order to help sell the pictures abroad. In the case of Destroy All Monsters, the dubbing was recorded in Tokyo by a company called Frontier Enterprises, which was owned by an ex-GI named Bill Ross. Ross did a lot of work for the Japanese film industry, not just dubbing, but he was also an actor, an assistant director, production manager, and so on. And for his dubbing operation, he employed many of the same non-professional English-speaking actors who appeared on camera in Japanese films.
So after American International folded and its version of the film was no longer distributed, the Frontier dub, which is often known as the International dub, became the standard English version of the film. And that really, really rankles people such as myself. It's just not nostalgia at work here. There are real differences. Today, if you're a resourceful fan, you'll be able to find the AIP dub with just a click of a few buttons. And if you're not familiar, how will you know the difference between the AIP dub and the dreaded International dub? Well, the first clue is the narrator. The voice of Norman Rose in the AIP version is full of gravitas. The International dub narrator has a goofy voice, which is somewhat nondescript. In the big press conference scene, the International dub has Dr. Yoshida telling the reporters, "All I can say now is what I said 20 years ago, remember that typhoon." And at the end of the conference, he excuses himself by saying, "I'm tired." In the AIP dub, he's actually talking about, the monsters attacking the world, just like he should be.
In the so-called international dub, Andrew Hughes, the older Caucasian man, sounds like an asthmatic Colonel Pickering. Dubbing is a thankless and difficult job. Even the AIP dub of this film has its flaws. Watching the previous scene as a kid, I remember being confused as to why the astronauts were hell-bent on burning up this thing that looked like it fell off of Robbie the Robot. I didn't know it was the device that the aliens used to control the monster because in the dialogue, all they say about it is, "It looks important." This is not a pet rock, it's actually a hibernating key lock. And it begs the question as to why the key locks want to conquer Earth if our atmosphere doesn't support their existence. Here's a great practical joke that we all wish we could play on our friends. Godzilla's attacking the city. Ah, just kidding.
One member of the special effects art department which really deserves a shout out for this film is the backdrop painter, Fuchimu Shimakura. The backdrop paintings in Toho special effects films are instrumental in giving depth and life to so many of the miniature sets, yet they're often taken for granted. Destroy All Monsters contains probably his most famous work, the enormous Mount Fuji landscape that frames the big climax. Talk to anyone who's worked on these films, and to a man they will always mention the Mount Fuji set as one of the most realistic backdrops ever made. This scene starts off with a long shot of the military and news people with Mount Fuji as a background. Except it isn't Mount Fuji, it's actually a matte shot substituting the Mount Fuji backdrop painting as a skyline. It's very easy to miss. As art director Yasuyuki Inoue remarked, when you first see the scene on film, you think it's the real Mount Fuji until Godzilla happens to walk into the picture. Shimakura was a specialist in his field, working his magic with an airbrush on the huge fabric sheets that curve around the back walls of the sound stages, much like a huge cyclorama, adding to the set's sense of depth. Now, this extreme long shot shows off just how big the miniature set really is. This is the Aokigahara area in the shadow of Mount Fuji. And take a look in the foreground and you'll notice a garbage mat of a rock formation. That's often what they had to use to cover up something unexpected that shouldn't have been in the frame, like a staff member's head, or a wayward light stand, or the bottom of the set.
Godzilla's transformation from a threat into a hero began in Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, and arguably it's complete in this scene, as Godzilla leads the monster army against the enemy. This big battle was filmed on stage number 11, the largest stage on the Toho lot at that time, and it was built specifically for special effects filming. The ceiling in stage 11 was nearly twice as tall as those of the other stages, so the backdrop painting could be much larger than usual, and that enabled the filmmakers to create a much larger sense of scale. One of the limiting factors when shooting miniatures is the maximum height of the horizon. The camera can only be pulled back so far before you risk revealing the top of the set, so this stage with its extra height allowed for much wider shots. Stage 11 was demolished after Eiji Tsuburaya died in 1970.
Eiji Tsuburaya was always getting letters from kids asking to see a real monster, so he arranged for Toho to invite to the studio around 100 kids who would be entering first grade. Now in Japan, entrance into grade school typically involves a special ceremony to welcome the kids. So this lucky bunch got to see all the monsters on the set rather than enduring the usual set of boring speeches from school officials. On March 26, 1968, the kids assembled at the Mount Fuji set in stage 11 and were entertained by all 11 monsters, and they were also greeted by stars Akira Kubo and Yukiko Kobayashi.
While there were only a couple of new monster suits made for this film, A number of small puppet figures of the monsters were made, almost all of which are seen here in this scene. Crude puppets of Manda and Baragon get a quick glimpse, and the larger Varan puppet drops in from the sky. And then, as King Ghidorah approaches and looks down on the Earth monsters, the 5 monsters on the ground are all small puppets, and the Godzilla and Rodan puppets were actually originally made for the film Invasion of Astro Monster.
King Ghidorah's arrival at the battlefield is one of the most impressive money shots in any Godzilla film. It starts with the camera's point of view from above King Ghidorah looking down at all the other monsters on the set. This perspective alone is pretty ambitious, something they never attempted in previous films. But then we get a ground view shot of the Earth monsters all scattering as Ghidorah drops down from the sky in their midst. Suit actor Susumu Utsumi is actually inside of King Ghidorah here, which means there is incredible weight on the wires that are lowering him to the set, yet the wires go unnoticed and he really nails the landing, keeping his balance and flexing his legs at just the right moment. A perfectly timed cloud of dust goes up and all the other suit actors scatter at just the right moment. It's a perfectly executed effect which really makes you feel like a living creature has just descended, and it serves as a really exciting start for the big battle. No matter how many times I watch this scene, I never fail to be thoroughly impressed by it.
So, how did Toho cast all these monsters in one movie? Was there a kaiju cattle call? Even though the budget was a bit bigger than the studio's recent monster movies, it was still not enough to build an entire gang of monster suits and still meet all the other demands of the production. It was both practical and pragmatic for Toho to search the storage shed for whatever was still usable, and in doing so they found 9 monsters in various states of disrepair. Several monsters from recent films were still in usable condition. Gorosaurus from King Kong Escapes was still practically new. The Minya costume and the Kumonga spider puppet, both from 1967's Son of Godzilla, were also in excellent condition and ready for action.
Monster suits and props that were a little older were pulled from storage and fixed up. After its second appearance in Monster Zero, King Ghidorah had been placed into storage with its wing fabric removed and the wings folded up. To spruce up the 3-headed monster, the wing attachments to the body were made stronger and now covered in scales, giving them a much more integrated look into the body. The wing fabric was replaced with vinyl sheeting, which made the wings stiffer and straightened the tips out. While the eyes looked pure black, the whites of the eyes were actually done up in red. Overall, the repaired King Ghidorah looks about as good as it ever did. The Rodan suit, originally built for Ghidorah in Monster Zero, appears in its 3rd film here. Unlike Ghidorah, Rodan was looking pretty shabby with both the neck and the head in very poor condition. The head was slightly touched up with some random skin texture that was added to the neck and to disguise a deformation, which is quite obvious in close-ups. The stomach area required a lot of repair, and despite all of these repairs, the finished product actually looks dirtier than it had in the previous films. 2 wire-operated flying Rodan puppets were also reused, one of them the same size as the suit, but with no one inside, of course. When this puppet arrives for the climactic battle at Mount Fuji, you can see its neck and face are looking up. A smaller-scale flying puppet was used for the scenes such as chasing the SY-3 and where Rodan is attacked by the fire dragon. Once again, we see King Ghidorah pull off a perfectly natural flying maneuver, this time lifting off to take his attack to the air. The key is the fact that the actor is still inside the suit. The slight movement he uses to push off and rise, combined with a well-timed wing flap and smoke effects, again, it makes this scene totally believable. Mothra only appears in caterpillar form via a mechanical model held over from Mothra vs. Godzilla and Ghidorah. The adult flying Mothra prop that was last seen fighting Godzilla in Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster had deteriorated too much to be considered for usage in this film. In the case of Manda, the giant snake prop from Atragon was rescued from storage, but outfitted with a new head minus the horns. Manda's big scene is the monorail destruction, so it's possible that the horns were deleted to make it easier to attach wires to the sides of the head for pulling the puppet through the monorail support beams. A few years earlier, after Frankenstein Conquers the World was completed, the Baragon monster suit was borrowed by Tsuburaya Productions and modified several times to create new monsters for the TV shows Ultra Q and Ultraman. By the time the suit was returned to Toho, it was so damaged and fragile that it could only be used in a cameo appearance at the film's conclusion. New and smaller ears were attached to the head because the original ears had long since been removed for Baragon's TV work.
The last and certainly the least of the recycled monsters was Varan. Varan first appeared in 1958 in the movie Varan the Unbelievable, and the monster suit for that film had long since been destroyed, but a smaller Wireworks puppet that had been used for publicity photos still existed. Toho suit maker Teizo Toshimitsu fixed it up and gave it a nice new paint job, but in the end, Varan is only very briefly seen arriving by air at the final climactic battle. Only 2 new monster suits were made, Godzilla and Anguillas. The job of making Anguillas was given to Nobuyuki Yasamaru, who represented a new generation of monster suit men at Toho. Yasamaru had worked in the plaster department building miniature structures when he first joined Toho around the time of Mothra, and later he made his debut as a suit maker in King Kong Escapes, creating Gorosaurus. Yasamaru and his crew built a new Anguillus that looks a lot more impressive than the original design from 1955's Godzilla Raids Again. The original Anguillus had rows of straight spines on its backplate like a big pin cushion, but this new one has spikes made from balsa wood and they're covered in fiberglass resin plastic. Anguillus's pebbly skin was cast into latex from plaster molds, and this technique would become a staple of suit making at Toho in years to come. Here's another wow-inducing moment. Watch as the fire dragon zooms down on the monsters and Godzilla turns it away with a blast of atomic breath. The animation of the ray swinging around is done very nicely, and the effects crew added some interactive lighting as if Godzilla's ray is lighting up the sky.
While Yasamaru and the younger staff members built Anguillus, the men who created the very first Godzilla suit in 1954, that would be sculptor Teizo Toshimitsu and the Yagi brothers, Kanji Yagi and Koei Yagi, they now made their last Godzilla suit as a team. For the previous year's Son of Godzilla, the Godzilla suit that had been made was much larger than normal in order to emphasize the size difference between Godzilla and Minya. It was too big for veteran Monsters suit actor Haruo Nakajima, who had to be replaced by a different stuntman for that role. Now Nakajima was back in the saddle, and so a new Godzilla suit was needed. For the head, the suit-making team borrowed the same base mold from the Godzilla vs. the Thing suit, but they really could never make exactly the same thing twice. This Godzilla sports a kind of bristly skin texture on its face, which was the result of mixing latex rubber with sawdust in order to build up facial details and to smooth out all the flaws in the base mold. Godzilla was made with a much wider jaw and longer fangs to make the face more expressive. And in creating the body shape, urethane foam was sculpted into arm and leg muscles, which become very prominent on this suit. Fasteners for disguising the back zipper were put on the left side of the back fins. Now at this time, the fins had become much thicker in shape, with a secondary row of fins looking more spiked than it had before. For the first time, the fins were highlighted with silver paint rather than gray or white, but on film the appearance is still an organic light shade of gray. While Godzilla doesn't look quite as massive as he did in earlier films of this decade, this suit provided suit actor Nakajima with a lot of flexibility to perform physical stunts, and this suit would survive to be used as the main filming costume for 3 more features through Godzilla vs. Gigan in 1972.
The man inside the Godzilla suit, of course, is Haruo Nakajima, a stunt actor who assumed the role as far back as the original Godzilla in '54. With nobody to teach him the craft of monster suit acting, Nakajima became the default expert in this field, and over time special effects supervisor Eiji Tsuburaya came to rely on Nakajima to not only create his own performance, but to even take charge of other suit actors and choreograph battles.
Monster suit acting was a rather thankless task, since Tsuburaya was reluctant to publicize that the monsters were men in suits, but in recent years Nakajima has gained a lot of notoriety for his role, and in 2010 he even published his autobiography in Japan. In his chapter on Destroy All Monsters, Nakajima talks about the large number of suit actors that were needed for this film. Some of them were Toho people, but they also hired some outsiders specially for this film. And if there weren't enough actors on hand, sometimes even one of the special effects stagehands would be pressed into momentary service to wear a suit, as happened one time when crewman Tadaaki Watanabe donned the Anguilla suit.
The person credited with playing Anguillas in the movie is Yu Sakita, whose name is sometimes written in English as Hiroshi Sakita, who was one of Nakajima's favorite co-stars. Sakita previously had played Sanda, the brown gargantua, Ebida, the giant crustacean in Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, and both Mechanicong and Gorosaurus in King Kong Escapes. Sakita was a stuntman by trade and a skilled swimmer and judo expert. He started appearing in films in the 1950s, and one of his earliest was the famous Japanese New Wave film Crazed Fruit.
When the fire dragon flies by and Godzilla and all the other monsters are looking up at it, Nakajima ordered the other actors to try and show their defiance to it. As he wrote in his autobiography, quote, "There shouldn't be any scene where monsters aren't moving. When I see in the recent movies the same kind of scenes, I'm always thinking, do something. It's no fun when the monsters aren't moving at all." Now, Nakajima claims to have choreographed the final battle, and while he certainly was the leader of the suit actors and functioned as the de facto assistant director, the fact is that a good portion of the battle is so precisely orchestrated that it's hard to believe that he could have made up everything. In the case of fights that involved more physical fighting and wrestling, it's natural that he would have taken control and have been able to improvise. But the battle with Ghidra required precise choreography due to all the wires, and the battle plan closely mirrors what is graphically represented in the storyboards that were drawn up long before these scenes went before the camera. No doubt Nakajima was the key player and got things to happen, but at least here the basics had already been blocked out in advance. Despite that, the difficulties that Nakajima remembered most were not so much in coordinating everybody's actions, but in trying to avoid the multitude of wires on the set. This film featured several wire-controlled monsters like Manda, Varan, and Kumonga. While there was an actor inside of King Ghidra, aside from filling up the body and taking an occasional step forward, the suit was almost completely animated by wires. The heads and tails each had several control wires attached. The wings were supported and flapped via wires. And there were additional wires on the body for supporting the actor. Each wire was controlled by a stagehand located in the rafters over the set. In addition, any monsters with a tail also had one or two wires attached to it. To navigate among the maze of wires to act out the scene was extremely difficult, and it limited what kind of action could actually be performed. To break a wire would virtually guarantee a bad take, so the monsters just couldn't go wherever they wanted to, and to make matters worse, the more wires, the more unpredictable a monster's movements became.
Incidentally, the suit actor inside Minya was a midget wrestler who billed himself as Little Man Machan, or Marchan the Dwarf. He played Minya in all three of his 1960s appearances.
Effects director Arakawa was especially appreciative of Marchan's efforts and patience because the job took a great physical toll on him. Arakawa fondly remembers that Marchan presented him with an electric shaver after filming concluded, and as of 2000, he was still using it and said it reminded him of the good old days. Now, I expect that for many fans who encountered it after the 1960s, Destroy All Monsters isn't held in the highest esteem, and I often hear the claim that it's overrated by the older generation. To some extent, it's not hard to understand why. For one thing, the first exposure to this film by newer fans has probably been to that dreadful international version with its horrendous dubbing script and voice acting. The first time I ever saw that version, I immediately thought afterwards that I would not have liked this film very much if that had been my first viewing. That's how bad it is. But in addition, newer generations have grown up with films that have featured lots of monsters and far more special effects scenes than what you see here, so for them, the reaction is often, what's the big deal? It's an unfortunate reality that it's difficult for people to judge this and most any film on its own terms in the context of when the movie was first produced and screened. All I can say in response is that in 1968, this was absolutely stunning, something which took Godzilla films to a whole new level, unlike anything that had come before. There are few films which you see in your life that are game changers, these quantum leaps ahead, much like Star Wars and Jurassic Park have been. For a giant monster fan growing up in the 60s like myself, this film was that kind of event.
When I look at this movie now, I see the end of an era, the last great effort from a group of filmmakers and actors who knew their world was changing fast. Actress Yukiko Kobayashi remembered that when she was making this film at Toho, the studio, quote, felt desolated and empty. There were quite a few stages not in use, and I realized that the tide of the time was changing from theatrical films to TV, end quote. And I suspect everyone on this film felt that sense of a sea change coming and tried their best to go out with a bang, and that they did.
For help preparing this commentary, we'd like to thank Mariko Godziszewski, Oki Miyano, Eddie Kozu, Ryuji and Yuko Honda, and Stuart Galbraith. Thanks very much for listening.